Hey guys, today I want to talk to you about conclusions in science. So we've gone through our whole Clover experiment. We started with observing and wondering, and we've gone through all the steps. We came up with a question, we identified our variables, we wrote our hypotheses, then we wrote our procedures and carried out our test, and created our data table and our graph, and now we need to look at writing a conclusion. So let's review a little bit. So here, what a conclusion is that conclusions are completed at the end of an experiment after all your data has been collected and analyzed. They are usually written in a paragraph form and in complete sentences and answer the following questions. So the first sentence is usually a description of what your experiment is about. So briefly lay out what your experiment was about. Then in the second sentence, you're going to restate the hypothesis that was supported by your data. So you might say, our data supported our H2, and then explain why. And then you're going to explain what happened in your experiment using data to explain it. And then the fourth thing you're going to do is tell what errors you made and talk about what you would like to further investigate. This is not a time to say that you did it perfect. Nobody ever does it perfect. So make sure that you understand that you've got to explain what you did wrong or what you could improve the next time, or where your investigation takes you. So let's think back. We're going to go through two examples. The first, remember this one, does the different types of fruit affect minion heart rate? Okay, so our variables in our experiment were our independent variable was our type of fruit. Our dependent variable was the heart rate of the minion. So that was what we were measuring. What we were changing was the type of fruit. The independent variable, what we were measuring, was the heart rate. The dependent variable. Then our controls, or all the things that we're keeping the same in the experiment, are the same type of minion, the same environment during the test, the same amount of fruit, the same type of day that the tests are run, all kinds of things. When we get to talking about controls, we could just keep listing them and listing them and listing them. So in this experiment, our hypotheses were the null was the type of fruit has no effect on the heart rate of a minion. Our H1 was that bananas will cause the minion's heart rate to be the highest. H2 was that apples will cause the minion's heart rate to be the highest. And our H3 was that the oranges will cause the minion's heart rate to be the highest. Okay, so here's our data. So we look and see that the apple made the heart rate 11 beats per minute. The banana was 23 beats per minute, and the orange was 7 beats per minute on average. So let's write a short conclusion for this experiment. So here we go. That's sentence 1. For this experiment, we were testing how different types of fruit affect minion heart rate. We found that the banana caused the minions to have the greatest heart rate with an average of 23 beats per minute. This data supported our H1 hypothesis. Now notice that they wrote those two things together. They gave data to support, and then they talked about which hypothesis was supported. You can write those in either order. You could say the data that was supported by, or the H1 hypothesis was supported by our data, and then explain the data. So either one is fine. And then next time, we would make sure to keep the fruit in a secure location prior to testing, because one of the minions ate all the fruit right before we were about to test. And in the future, we would want to test other types of fruit. So we hit those 4 sentences. Okay, so let's look at our Clover experiment. And we'll write our conclusion for our Clover experiment. So remember, our question was, does the amount of water affect the number of days it takes the clover to germinate or sprout? And we had an independent variable, which was 5 or 10 or 20 milliliters of water. Then we measured the number of days it takes for it to grow. Oh, that should say to germinate. Sorry, I caught that. I'll check that. I'm going to fix it right now. To germinate. Okay. And then some of the controls that we had were the same environment, the same temperature, the same amount of sunlight, the same time of day when they were watered, the same time of day when they were measured. So you can see here was our day 1, and here for us was day 6, but you can't see it because it's behind my face. Okay. So our experiment, our hypotheses were, the null hypothesis was that the amount of water will have no effect on the number of days it takes to germinate. The H1 was that the clover watered with 5 milliliters of water will germinate in the fewest number of days. H2 was the clover watered with 10 milliliters of a day will germinate in the fewest number of days. And then our H3 was the clover watered with 20 milliliters of water a day will germinate in the fewest number of days. So here we came up with our procedure and we laid out each of the steps. We used, again, remember we need our 4 rules, numbered steps, short, easy to follow steps, start with an action word, and include amounts and details. And you can see that in here we did a pretty good job of that. You're always going to make mistakes, always going to make mistakes when you talk about making procedures. So we can always add stuff in at the end if we realize it. Okay, so here's our data table. So our data shows that our data was very different from other teachers, by the way. But our data showed that at 5 milliliters per day, it took 5.6 days for them to germinate. With 10 milliliters, it took 4 days to germinate, and with 20 milliliters, it took 4.8 days to germinate. So when I made a graph of that data, it looks like this. And again, we look at the title, the amount of water, the x-axis and the y-axis, and they all match. And then we look at what we notice. We can see that the 5 milliliters lager took the longest to germinate. The 10 milliliters of water took the fewest days to germinate, and the 20 was kind of in between the two. So let's write our conclusion. Again, remember we want to do 4 things. We want to explain what the experiment was about, so briefly describe what you did, 1 sentence. Then in 1 to 2 sentences, you're going to restate the hypothesis that was supported by your data, and then I use data to explain that. Then explain what happened, and then how would you make it better, fix errors, or investigate. So here we go. In this experiment, we were investigating to see if the amount of water affected how long it took for the clover to germinate. That's our sentence 1, explain what the experiment was about. In step 2, or the next thing is we found that the clover being watered with 10 milliliters each day took the fewest numbers of days to germinate. It took an average of 4 days. This data supports our H2 hypothesis. So you notice I took 3 sentences to do these 2 and 3 here. I restated what hypothesis was supported, and then I explained the data. And then it says, one problem we had during the experiment was the clover germinated so fast I had to take it home, which changed one of the variables and also caused 2 plants to spill in my car, changing how those 2 were planted. Next time I would wait to plant until I could watch the clover without having to move the clover to another location. So I covered again in the last step here, what would I do to make it better? So I told you how I would fix the errors and what I might do for further investigation. So this is really how you write a conclusion, and this is a great way, a great resource to come back to when we write our conclusions for other experiments. So I hope that was helpful.